So, good evening, everybody. Our distinguished Buber lecturer, Professor Jonathan Israel, our distinguished Academy Fellow, Chair of Humanities Division, Professor Yosef Kaplan, former Academy President, Professor Menachem Yaari, Academy members, dear friends, distinguished guests. It is my sheer delight to chair the 2017 Buber Memorial Lecture. It is a sheer delight to chair the lecture when the lecturer is Professor Jonathan Israel. My main task here is to welcome you all and to share with you the historical background for establishing this annual lecture. Later on, Professor Kaplan will introduce Professor Jonathan Israel. Our academy, unlike many other academies, is a comprehensive one. We have two divisions, sciences and humanities, which comprises also social sciences and law. Presidents rotate. I am the second woman president, proud to succeed my dear friend Ruth Arnon. The Israel Academy was established in 1959. 20 years later, in 1979, the Academy decided to commemorate the centennial of Albert Einstein's birth and to establish a series of distinguished lectures in the natural sciences bearing his name. Past lectures have included several Nobel laureates. The Humanities Division wished to have a distinguished lecture as well. And indeed, in 2009, its Jubilee year, the Academy decided to establish a series of distinguished lectures in the humanities or the social sciences to be named after the Academy's first president, Martin Buber. Among Martin Buber Memorial Lectures speakers were Michael Walzer, Carlo Ginzburg. Carlo Ginzburg spoke about inner dialogues, Christians, Jews, and miracles in 18th century England. Jürgen Habermas speaking about a philosophy of dialogue. And last year, Guido Calabresi talking about a fable on equality, actually analyzing the impact of the quest for equality on the American elections. Martin Buber is famous for his thesis of dialogical existence. The word pairs of I, you, and I, it categorize the modes of consciousness, interaction, and being through which an individual engages with other individuals, inanimate objects, and all reality in general. The topic of Professor Israel's lecture, Jewish Emancipation in the Western World, incarnates, in a way, the notion of dialogue, be it a dialogue between cultures, between religions, between nations, between human beings. So, we shall soon have the chance to hear Professor Israel, but let me first call upon my dear friend, Yosef Kaplan, to introduce our Buber lecturer, Professor Jonathan Israel. Please, Yosef.
Cosmopolitan Islanders is the title of a book by Richard Evans, Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, which discusses why so many British historians have chosen to study European history rather than work on Britain, how they learn the necessary languages, and what impact their work has had on the countries they study. Jonathan Israel, who studied at Cambridge University under some of the greatest historians of the 20th century, is indeed a cosmopolitan historian. His historiographical opus spans the globe. Though he began his career as a historian of the Hispanic world and later became a leading scholar of the Netherlands, anyone reading his books cannot fail to be amazed at the vast historical scope characteristic of his scholarship. Every continent is included in it. At the start of his career, he concentrated on economic and political history, but for the past 25 years, he has been entirely devoted to a monumental project which has made him into one of the most prominent scholars of modern intellectual history. Although Jewish history is not, ostensibly, an area of his specialization, he wrote the best book about the Jews in the early modern period, European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550-1750, published in Oxford in 1985. In writing his books and articles, he combed dozens of archives and libraries in many countries. The extent of the documentation upon which his work is based is breathtaking, and no reader can fail to be impressed by his erudition and diligence, which are second to none. Jonathan Israel's untiring intellectual curiosity is famous. Following his studies with John Eliot, the leading historian of early modern Spain, he decided to write his thesis on the Hispanic world. He concentrated on colonial Mexico, studied in Mexico for a year, burrowed through archives and libraries in Mexico and Spain, and wrote a fascinating dissertation under the direction of Hugh Trevor Roper concerning the connection between racial and ethnic groups and the politics of colonial Mexico. His first book, which was based on his doctorate, was published in 1975. In 1974, he began to teach in University College London. Influenced by Professor Koen Swart, the Dutch historian who held the chair on Dutch history at that university, he began to deal with the history of the Netherlands. He brought his expertise as a Hispanist with him, and thus focused at first on the complex relations between the Dutch Republic and Spain. He sought to examine the motives behind Spain's stubborn prolongation of the confrontation with the Dutch Republic. The central conclusion that he reached was that the Spanish wished to thwart the colonial expansion of the Dutch, who were undermining both the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean region as well as the entire Portuguese mercantile system at the time that Portugal was part of the Spanish Empire, especially in East Asia. The two books that he published during the 1980s, The Dutch Republic and the Hispanic World, and Dutch Primacy in World Trade, showed him to be one of the leading historians of the Dutch Republic. His expertise in the Hispanic world and in Dutch history encouraged him to investigate the place of Dutch Sephardic Jews and of New Christians in the struggles between the maritime powers and the part played by the Sephardi Jews in European colonial expansion. A series of path-breaking studies which he wrote on this subject shed new light on the social and cultural character of the Western Sephardic diaspora, on the Sephardic social elite in Amsterdam, and on the extensive economic and colonizing activity of New Christians and Sephardic Jews in the four corners of the earth. In 1995, his monumental study, The Dutch Republic, Its Rise, Greatness, and Fall, was published. No aspect of Dutch history escaped Israel's meticulous and judicious treatment based on primary sources from countless libraries and archives. He discusses political and economic developments, the impact of the Reformation and the rise of Calvinism, the rebellion against Spain, Dutch culture in the Golden Age, art, architecture, intellectual life, and much more. In 2004, the Dutch magazine Historisch Nieuwsblad addressed the members of the Royal Netherlands Historical Society, asking what were the most important books written about Dutch history. It seems that there was broad agreement among the 100 respondents regarding the leading 15 publications. 14 out of the 15 were written by Dutch historians, and Jonathan Israel stood out as the only non-Dutch historian to be included in the list. His book was ranked second after the iconic book by Johan Huizinga, Nederlands beschaving in the 17e eeuw, Dutch civilization in the 17th century. However, without doubt, Israel's book is the most comprehensive and exhaustive study of the history of the Dutch Republic ever to be published. In 2001, when Jonathan Israel was appointed as professor of modern history at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, Radical Enlightenment was published, the first volume of a trilogy presenting a new understanding of the Enlightenment and its meaning for the modern world. Israel seeks to distinguish between mainstream Enlightenment, represented by thinkers such as Locke, Hume, Voltaire, and Kant, and Radical Enlightenment, which drew inspiration from the philosophy of Spinoza and was developed by lesser-known thinkers such as Edelman, Lametrie, Dolbach, Denis Diderot, and others. The values espoused by these thinkers, including personal freedom, democracy, the universal right to knowledge, endowed the Enlightenment with revolutionary meaning for everything, no matter how deeply rooted it was in society, was questioned in the light of philosophical reason. Jonathan Israel's impressive oeuvre is unique in that he succeeded in documenting the semi-clandestine Spinozist networks in details, the thinkers and authors who disseminated the values of the Radical Enlightenment in Europe and the Americas. After completing the trilogy on the Enlightenment, in 2014, he published a comprehensive study on the French Revolution, revolutionary ideas and intellectual history of the French Revolution, which was awarded the Prose Award in European and world history. In this book, Israel investigated the conflict among three fractions that struggled for supremacy, while it was only one of them, the Democratic Republicans, who advanced the ideas of the Radical Enlightenment. Jonathan Israel's books have received worldwide attention. They have been translated into many languages, and conferences and symposia have been held on them in several countries. Among the scholars who wrote critical reviews of the trilogy on the Enlightenment, no one failed to express admiration for Israel's phenomenal erudition or to praise him for redeeming dozens of books and pamphlets from oblivion and for his success in presenting a new and fascinating narrative on the Enlightenment. The book also provoked lively and even heated intellectual debate. I followed some of these debates and could only be impressed by Jonathan Israel's intellectual vitality in responding to most of his critics and defending his interpretation thoroughly, honestly, and consistently. At this very time, a new book by Jonathan Israel has appeared, An Expanding Blaze, How the American Revolution Ignited the World, 1775-1865, 1848, yet another link in his ambitious intellectual project in which the research for every book heralds the one that will follow it. Dear Jonathan, we are honored and pleased that you have accepted our invitation to give the 2017 Buber lecture, and we are very happy to welcome you and your wife Annette to Jerusalem and to the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen, that was a magnificent introduction, by far the best one I ever received, but you have to understand that it was too generous. First of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is for my wife and for myself to be in Jerusalem at this time, and what an honor it is to have been invited to give this lecture and to be able, what a great pleasure it is to be able to be here and to give this lecture to you this evening. I'll just get the pointer going, and there is my title. Now, Martin Buber, who died in June 1965 at the venerable age of 87, was without doubt one of the greatest Jewish intellectual figures of the 20th century. No one else brought so powerfully to the fore the question of whether there is a cultural Zionism that stands distinct from the political state-orientated Zionism. Few pressed as assiduously from the Jewish side for Arab-Jewish friendship and political concord. No one else tried as hard to get Mahatma Gandhi, to grasp the true nature of the Jewish predicament in the late 1930s, and no one else raised as powerfully the question whether there is such a thing as a Jewish humanistic, cultural, and moral legacy able to survive in the modern world as a meaningful tradition separate from the traditional Judaism of observance and submission to rabbinic religious authority. This evening, I'm going to pose the question of the Western Enlightenment's relationship to the Jews and Judaism, to review what kind of Enlightenment it was that set the scene for Jewish legal and political emancipation in post-1789 Europe, and to, perhaps a little too ambitious, but I want to try to reconsider the nature of the Jewish revolutionary consciousness that grew out of the long and inconclusive struggle required for Jewish emancipation. Remember, this was a very long drawn-out and contested business. I'm going to describe, perhaps it's useful to begin just with a very brief chronology, only the first phase down to 1791, when the French National Assembly emancipated the Jews in France. It's a story of one step forward and often two steps back, when the British Parliament was the first legislature to even consider some form of selective naturalization, which would give equality to some Jews. Massive anti-Semitic outcry, a very broad-based response in Britain, completely counteracted it by 1753. And this bitterly contested process, the great difficulty of integrating the Jews on an equal basis into European society, was to continue decade after decade after decade. It's amazing to see how fiercely contested it still is in the middle of the 19th century, and usually rejected. Still in Hungary, in Switzerland, lots of German states, Sweden, many countries which are supposed to be at the forefront of, and were at the forefront of developments in the 19th century. The process of Jewish emancipation in its legal and its formal aspects is not completed until the 1860s and 70s. Amazing though that is. So we're talking about an enormously long and very complex and very, very profoundly and bitterly contested process. So I want to ask, how in the end did the Enlightenment change Jews and Judaism, and whether there is or is not such a thing as an enlightened Jewish secularism that is distinct and that can survive as a national tradition in the 21st century. Now, the famous historian Shmuel Ettinger once wrote that in its attitude to the Jews, the Enlightenment was not lacking, this is a quote, lacking in ambivalence. Well, after the quarter of century or so that I've been studying the Enlightenment, I don't think this is actually quite correct. Rather, modern historiography shows a certain amount of vacillation and difficulty in defining how the Enlightenment exactly, and the complex way that it responded to the question of the place of the Jews in European culture. Well, the Enlightenment, everyone here knows, was a secularizing, rationalizing, intellectual movement seeking the general amelioration of society, not least by changing the relationship of religion to society. It began among intellectuals, scientists, and writers in the later 17th century, with the Jewish philosopher Spinoza prominent among its forerunners, its principal forerunners. Before long, it developed into an international movement for general amelioration of mankind, at first concentrating on rendering society more tolerant, more rational, open-minded, which meant, of course, reforming education, encyclopedias, press laws, and public debate, making society less tied to dogma and tradition, and better adjusted to the most up-to-date science. Before long, though, inevitably, the Enlightenment also eventually developed powerful political ramifications with a growing focus on transforming early modern absolutist monarchy into a more benevolent, ameliorating style of government, less rooted than earlier kingship in tradition and precedent, less concerned with dynastic glory, and less fixated on promoting religious uniformity in the manner of Philip II of Spain or Louis XIV of France. The concern was for a style of royal government that was more dedicated to the general well-being and welfare of society as a whole. Such efforts to reform the convoluted legacy of the past could proceed only so far, however, while at the same time preserving the basic social and institutional format of early modern Europe. If you were going to conserve the hierarchical, stratified, strongly aristocratic form of society everywhere prevalent at the time, including within Jewish society, this process I'm describing could only proceed so far. And here we arrive at one of the main themes of my lecture this evening. For I think we modern Jews, whether we are religious or secular, tend to forget not just how bound up with Jewish observance and rabbinic authority, but how oligarchic and hierarchical both Sephardic and Ashkenazic community life and institutional organization actually were before 1789. Consequently, the impulses fermenting the Enlightenment in turn inevitably also generated a more radical tendency, as Josef Kaplan just described, a radical tendency which was, certainly in its early stages, essentially clandestine, forbidden, persecuted, and prohibited. And generally prohibited, in fact, at least in theory, until 1789, and in its early stages, an essentially underground movement, a movement that was intellectual in character, but with very broad social implications. So this is what we call today the Radical Enlightenment. This dimension, as we shall see, was absolutely decisive for understanding, or rather for the process, for driving the process of Jewish emancipation and the gaining of equal civil rights for Jews in modern Western society. Radical Enlightenment originated in the late 17th century as an irreligious, free-thinking, fiercely anti-ecclesiastical underground movement consisting of small hidden networks of free thinkers that later after a century or so, so say from the 1770s, the 1770s were a very important decade in broadening this process, developed into a much wider, more confident and more sweeping challenge to the old order, and eventually into an explicitly democratic, republican, revolutionary challenge aimed at wholly dismantling the prevailing system of monarchy, aristocracy, legal traditionalism, and religious authority, wanting to overturn the whole structure. It was the Radical Enlightenment, I think, it seems to me, I would venture to say without question, and not the Enlightenment as the whole, that is the specific root of modern universal and equal rights. So the question here is not just one relating to Jews, but for and the problem this poses, I think, is not just one that affects religious authority within a Jewish context, but is a problem for religious persons of whatever description. As Leo, I'm not by any means the first to point this out. This is a discussion that's been going on since the 1920s, and I believe Leo Strauss was the first significant scholar to point out this deep tension within the Enlightenment, or split between a moderate and mainstream Enlightenment, and to see that rejection of religious authority was the essential basis of this radical tendency. This is well illustrated by the problematics of such a conflict within the Enlightenment for all the religious traditions of Europe is well illustrated in the Jewish context by the discussion of Maimonides' interpretation or apparent interpretation of Jewish law with respect to the Noachites, the 7 Noachite laws, and the final redemption of the Gentiles. Most important and fascinating question. So one of the most crucial passages in Spinoza concerning Judaism is actually found in the chapter 5 of his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a chapter on ceremonies. And here he states that anyone who reads Scripture, believing anything in it while failing to grasp the philosophical, ethical doctrine embedded, which Spinoza thinks is the true basis of Scripture, who reads Scripture believing everything in it while failing to grasp the philosophical, ethical doctrine embedded in it Spinoza says, might just as well have been reading anything whatever with the same inadequate attention that the common people usually give to their reading. Correspondingly, Spinoza writes, he who knows nothing at all about Scripture, but does have salutary views about the world and a true conception of living, is truly happy. He then goes on to say in a manner which was greatly resented by the Jewish, late 19th century Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen, however, the Jews hold completely the opposite view. They think that true opinions and a true conception of life make no contribution to happiness whenever people receive them by the natural light of reason alone and not as teachings prophetically revealed to Moses. Maimonides dares openly assert this. End of quote. This, of course, is a very controversial passage. This is indeed a curious feature of Maimonides, where he appears to be making this point, and as many people here will know, one that it's an apparent assertion of Maimonides that greatly upset Moses Mendelssohn, the greatest Jewish Enlightenment figure after Spinoza. But of course, what Spinoza is really expressing here is not hostility to the Jews in the way that Hermann Cohen complained of, but rather asserting that observance, religious law, and rabbinic authority count for nothing compared to the light of philosophical reason in guiding human life, unless one is to be counted among the common people in the sense of being unable to read with any discernment and unable to judge and reason. And ever since the Enlightenment, inevitably, a great many Jews have, I think, obviously have agreed with this standpoint, otherwise what actually is the modern post-18th century international Jewish intelligentsia. Universal and equal rights, resting on a basis of democratic republicanism, consequently first entered the stage of the modern world exclusively as, or at least according to my analysis, exclusively as a minuscule minority conviction held only by repressed hidden networks, confined originally to just a few countries, but that by 1789 had grown formidable and pervasive throughout the Western world, thanks not least to the democratic republican element that surged up, especially at Philadelphia, in the American Revolution of the 1770s. Radical Enlightenment was a challenging, revolutionary set of ideas then, but a set of principles that makes very little sense unless we place it in the context of early modern social and political reality. Before 1789, the great majority of Europeans were legally and institutionally subordinated to the sway of the royal, aristocratic, and ecclesiastical in every European country and in every colony of the European lands, and to an extent that we can hardly even imagine. This needs emphasizing because, as a rule, neither historians nor philosophers, and certainly not churchmen or theologians, have given anything like enough emphasis to the ubiquity of medieval and early modern discrimination, subordination, hierarchy, and segregation. Before 1789, lifelong, inescapable subordination and degradation was the lot of the great majority of mankind, including nearly all women, servants, small tenant holders, artisans, serfs, slaves, soldiers, sailors, those born out of wedlock, colonized populations, and effectively all religious minorities, as well as the Jews. However, owing to their special outsider status, ghettoization in many parts and the formal rejection of Christian doctrine and teaching, the Jews were permanently, institutionally, and theologically locked in a special category of legalized discrimination, imprisoned in inferior status. They were heaped with contempt, organized degradation more comprehensive, except for the black population, we have to remember, than in all these other cases, subject to special restrictions, imposed with varying degrees of rigor in every European country, including extensive formal disabilities, exclusions, fiscal burdens, and specially devised marks of humiliation that did not apply to others. Utterly inferior status was the essence of the, I don't mean Christian view in an ethical or genuinely religious sense, but in the Christian ecclesiastical view of the Jews, whether Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. My point is that Jews were exceptionally heavily discriminated against, even in England and Holland at this time, and in the 18th century still, and regarded as these two countries, despite these two countries being regarded as the two most tolerant European countries. And I think the extent of this ghettoization, producing a people hated and despised with special scorn, gives the issue of Jewish emancipation a very particular complexion, which is, of course, different from what we find in respect to all these other groups. Mainstream Enlightenment made, and here Ettinger is absolutely right, actually made no effort to alter the basically hierarchical and oligarchic shape of early modern society, to proclaim the equality of races or extend equal rights to the majority, irrespective of whether groups were Jewish, non-Jewish, or whatever. As a rule, the mainstream Enlightenment, Voltaire, Frederick the Great, and Hume above all, were also marked by a disinclination to try to enlighten the mass of society as distinct from its elites. This often blended with a pronounced streak of cultural anti-Semitism, as a pervasive disdain for Jews and Jewish life, with Arthur Hertzberg, one of the greatest American Jewish personalities and intellectuals of the 20th century, in his classic work of 1968, The French Enlightenment and the Jews, The Origins of Modern Anti-Semitism, identified as the chief root of modern anti-Semitism as a system of thought. Voltaire, for instance, may have, I'm quoting from Hertzberg, denounced the persecutions of the Jews many times as evidence of the unworthiness of the churches, But in his own time, Voltaire's work encouraged anti-Semitism. Worse, his role in history was that of the crucial architect of the ambivalences that surrounded the Emancipation. His work made a fundamental contribution to its debacle. End of quote by Herzberg. A Reformed rabbi, Herzberg, as it happens, and not coincidentally, was also one of the most prominent Jewish figures who followed Martin Buber in seeking to define a broad cultural Jewishness separate from religion, and one tied to support of universal and equal human rights and actively promoting black emancipation. Herzberg did more than any other figure of the post-World War II American Jewry to warn of the dangers entailed in the Jewish world diaspora defining their Jewish identity purely in terms of fixation with the horrors of the Holocaust and unquestioning support for Israel. Jewish identity must have moral content addressed to the wider world. He was right in his analysis of the Enlightenment's relationship to the Jews up to a point, as well as in his claim that Jews had a special responsibility to back the black civil rights movement. But Herzberg missed a whole dimension that turns out to be decisively important for understanding the emergence of Jewish modernity. He simply didn't, he hadn't read his Leo Strauss, he hadn't really seen the crucial role of the Radical Enlightenment as a distinct current and tendency. This factor that Strauss first defined in the 1920s and that now seems so decisive for, I think, discussion of practically all Enlightenment issues. It was their sweeping rejection of religious authority in general that enabled radical enlighteners to view the narrow, cramped, disfigured character of 18th century Jewish society. Like most of the world's ills, this was their tendency, they viewed it as chiefly the fault of popular ignorance, fueled not by Christianity in its essence, but by apostolic and post-apostolic Christian theology, intolerance and bigotry allied to royal despotism. The degradation was entirely the fault of a system of theology, thought and assumptions radical enlighteners conceived to be a vast edifice of superstition and ignorance, a pernicious toolkit for generalized repression and persecution. Certainly these radicals showed no greater sympathy for rabbis, Talmud, traditional Judaism, and for Jewish community governance than they did for churches or Christian theology. But in the case of a figure I'm going to bring very much to your attention in the next few minutes, John Toland, and some other instances, they did sometimes respect strands of Jewish cultural achievement in a wider sense. Thus, for example, one of the hardest-hitting radical enlighteners of the 18th century, Chassis Clotes, a son of an Amsterdam merchant banker, later a zealous French revolutionary and declared enemy of the Robespierrists, a man who had no Jewish connections at all, in his 1783 text, Lettres sur les Juifs, à un ecclésiastique de mes amis, published in Berlin in 1783, chose not to present Jewish preoccupation with trade and finance as negative traits, but unlike most other radical philosophers, deemed this activity actually beneficial to society. But what is striking about his discussion is his willingness to see positive aspects to Jewish society in a much wider sense, including philosophy. So despite his aversion to Jewish observance and religious law, he acknowledged that the Jews showed a genuine capacity for philosophy and scholarly erudition, not just in the isolated case of Maimonides, but likewise in the instances he wrote of Abravanel, Pizarro, Mortera, Manasseh ben Israel, et Robbio. Dans les noms seuls, he says, typically, font trembler la théologie chrétienne. I had no idea who he meant by Pizarro until today. Joseph Kaplan instructed me on that point earlier. A rabbi of the early 18th century at Amsterdam and The Hague who added to the stock of unpublished but circulating among these underground radical circles, unpublished Jewish polemical works attacking Christian theology. So Radical Enlightenment totally repudiated religious authority, rights, and jurisdiction. The churches have no rights and have no jurisdiction over the individual, according to this way of thinking, and attacked all traditional Christian viewpoints. But not what they saw as Christianity in its pure form, as a moral idealism of justice and charity, in that respect following Spinoza, who adopts the same position. What they repudiated was Christianity, in inverted commas, functioning as an integral component of the existing monarchical aristocratic structure of society. These two strands of rejection of religious authority, coupled with opposing the monarchical aristocratic social order, were the essential elements in the Radical Enlightenment outlook, and those most crucial to this emerging revolutionary culture. Precisely these were also the principles that stimulated radical thinkers to take a much closer, more serious interest than did moderate enlighteners in unpublished, manuscript, systematic Jewish critiques of Christian theological arguments and beliefs, especially those of Robio de Castro, Mortera, and the Karaite Isaac of Trocky, but also this Belzaro. Texts they usually encountered circulating in these networks that I've described, usually found in French translation, or else in their they were, in most cases, written in Spanish or Portuguese originally, and these were also circulating in Holland and other parts of Europe. Their general stance rendered those enlighteners who rejected religious authority and social hierarchy in all its forms conspicuously readier to help dismantle the oppressive disabilities and discriminatory devices separating Jews and Judaism from the rest of society than were Voltaire, Montesquieu, or other mainstream philosophers. Understandably enough, given the stifling restrictions, oppression, and persecution of the past, this highly distinctive and implicitly revolutionary approach to the existing order and its qualified sympathy for the Jewish plight heaped most of the blame for the disfigurement of Jewish society and the narrowness of the Jewish occupation structure and the focus on money lending on the shoulders of existing institutions, rather than seeing it as, in some way, an inherent, inbuilt, inborn set of characteristics of the Jews as a people or as a race. In other words, Jewish emancipation only became an immediate and realistic proposition from the moment Europe's once former predominantly theological view of the world came to be fundamentally challenged by certain particular ideas. Hence, Radical Enlightenment is not just an important, but at least in my own view, effectively it's the only and exclusive reason that certain generally reviled non-Jewish writers of the 18th century began actively to press for Jewish emancipation. This did not happen on any significant scale until the late 18th century in the wake of writings of Klotz, who I was talking about just now, Diderot, Dolbach, Reynal, Dolm, Dietz, Mirabeau, Roederer, Brissot, and also Jewish radical Zalkind Hurwitz, a very interesting character who I'll come to a bit further on. But there are glimmerings already in the early 18th century. In particular, John Toland, 1670 to 1722, an Anglo-Irish convert from Catholicism, first to Protestantism and then to free thinking, was the first European radical enlightener to publish a text proposing the lifting of all restrictions and disabilities on the Jews and the elevating of the Jews by means of what he called a general naturalization to full equality with Christians. Typically, for the Radical Enlightenment, even if highly untypically for most of society at the time, Toland laid the blame for the problem posed by Jewish marginality and narrow occupation structure, marginality and narrow occupation structure. He laid the blame almost entirely on the Christian churches and their theology, along with what radicals viewed as the insidious and cunning alliance of priests with princes, with the aim, this is how they thought, radical enlighteners, with the aim of exploiting everyone else. In Toland's eyes, virtually none of the blame for their intolerable predicament rested with the Jews themselves. The Jews distorted and excessively narrow occupation range in the 17th and 18th centuries. They're concentrating almost entirely on finance, trade, money lending, and exchanges. He attributed, rather like the Zionists later, to their being excluded from public services, from most handicrafts, and from the guilds by laws and discrimination. The notorious narrowness of Jewish occupation structure, he maintained, quote, wholly proceeds from accident and not from nature. Toland, historians and philosophers nowadays are beginning to recognize, in a way they failed to do until recently, was in this and in many, in most important respects, not following Locke, which is what you find in all the conventional, rather superficial approaches to Toland and the English free thinking in the early 18th century, but is following Spinoza in rejecting, and is in fact rejecting John Locke's philosophy on many levels, especially at the most basic level. He's rejecting Locke's separation of all reality into a fundamental duality, the empirical on the one hand, and the sphere of above reason, supra rationem, governed by religious authority, mysteries and theology on the other. That, of course, is fundamental to Locke, completely rejected by Toland, and is generally rejecting Locke's views on religion and society. And in this specific case is doing so here, especially by viewing Jewish history as simply part of universal history without possessing any special, separate or sacred character, as well as in seeing all of humanity as one, without any inclinations, as he calls it, or characteristics specific to one people, ingrained by God or nature. Where previous advocates of Jewish re-entry to England, simply on the basis of residence rights, or to other lands in the 17th century, figures like Manasseh ben Israel tried to persuade rulers to admit Jews on the basis of Jewish commercial and financial usefulness by appealing to their mercantilist preoccupations. Toland was the first to demand Jewish reintegration on the basis of common rights and universal values, of the Jews being the same in essentials as everyone else, only more oppressed. In other words, on the basis of a strictly radical Enlightenment logic. Hence, it was Toland, the Republican, anti-Lockean, and inveterate foe of priestcraft, Toland, the radical Enlightener, who became the first openly and publicly proclaimed advocate of Jewish equality. For the radicals, starting with Toland, the plight of the Jews was simply the result of a combined political, theological system of irrationality and oppression. Their most inveterate enemies, explained Toland, were the priests, who devoutly offered up those human sacrifices, he means the victims of the Crusaders and of medieval popular anti-Jewish outbreaks, not only to share their goods with the rapacious prince, but also to acquire the reputation of zeal and sanctity among the credulous vulgar. It's a typical feature of the Radical Enlightenment, not just of Toland, who's a very good example of this. You see something similar in Spinoza, but of this whole tradition through the 18th century, that what is most dangerous to the best values in humanity are the credulous vulgar. That's the worst thing there is, the credulous vulgar. So this comes up again and again in Toland's explanation of why it's important that all the disabilities should be removed from the Jews. So in Toland's eyes, the Jews were not a people apart who had once been a people chosen by God, neither specially elected nor separate in any meaningful way. On the contrary, they were just like everyone else, no better, no worse. Their biblical history had no supernatural dimension. It is this combination of anti-monarchism, anti-scripturalism, and anti-ecclesiasticism, Toland's laying the blame for the plight of the Jews on past society, concepts, and institutions generally, that forms the core of his Radical Enlightenment stance on the Jewish question. The phenomenon of the modern revolutionary Jew adopting the secularizing principles of the Radical Enlightenment follows a logic which first became widely operative in the late 18th century, which means The modern Jewish revolutionary consciousness commenced earlier than is often realized and already took hold in the Western world prior to the revolution. So that follows directly, I think, from the points that I've been making up to now. The first consciously revolutionary Jews, figures like David Nassi in Suriname, Zalkind Hurwitz, who I'm coming to in a moment, a very interesting character, Abraham Furtado, Jacob Pereira, Junius Frey, and Hartog de Hartog Limon, not very well known in the wider Jewish world, but a crucial revolutionary in the 1790s and around 1800 in Holland, opened up. He was a Jewish doctor who had been caring for the Ashkenazic poor in Amsterdam, but was a key figure in the revolutionary consciousness of the Batavian Revolution in the 1790s. Opened up a wholly new avenue in Jewish life, followed later, of course, is much better known. Everyone knows about Ludwig Börner, Heinrich Heine, and of course Moses Hess, whom Martin Buber declared to be well known as the founder of the modern Zionist system of thought. Jewish radicals and revolutionaries who became notable activists in revolutionary movements in the late 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th century, moreover, unlike Karl Marx or Leon Trotsky later, did so while still envisaging as one of their main tasks the rescue and emancipation of the Jews as a people and their integration on the basis of full equality and universal rights into what they envisaged as the universal democratic republican society of the future. There existed then a specifically Jewish radical enlightenment, rejecting rabbinic authority and the sway of the Torah and Talmud over Jewish life, that historians need scrupulously to differentiate from the much better known, of course, mainstream Jewish enlightenment or Haskalah. The mainstream Jewish enlightenment, the Haskalah, is more moderate, traditionalist, and to most Jews more acceptable. It was a reformist trend, but it did not challenge Jewish tradition, separate community organization, peoplehood, or religious authority in principle, and therefore did not challenge the election of the Jews as a chosen people in the way Spinoza and his disciple Toland did. Neither were they seeking to overturn the political or social format of Ancien Regime Europe. Admittedly, one cannot regard the gulf between Haskalah and this Jewish radical Enlightenment fringe as absolute. So marginalized was Jewish status in early modern Europe that even this mainstream sometimes encouraged within itself a covert revolutionary strand. For Jews, as one scholar expressed it, Haskalah offered an escape route out of their centuries-old preoccupation with religion and allowed them to become Europeans. Mainstream Haskalah, beginning with the endeavors of Moses Mendelssohn, 1729 to 86, in the 1750s and 60s, was grounded in Jewish communities and tradition, and of course quickly spread from Germany westwards and eastwards into Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, and so on, leading to a contest with traditionalists that did not cease in the 19th century, but of course generated the struggle that still blasts loudly enough in Israel today. Well, that's another issue. While this moderate Jewish enlightenment made little effort to dismantle either rabbinic or communal authority, terminate separate Jewish schooling, or weaken society's monarchical, aristocratic, social and political base, it did encourage the tendency to bring the Jewish people more into the general context of social and political reform, and in particular support moves to lessen and eventually remove the special disabilities, fiscal burdens, and legal restrictions kept in place by society, government, and the churches. Yet when it comes to Jewish emancipation, universal and equal rights in the late 18th and early 19th century, it was never mainstream, as I've already argued, but rather the Radical Enlightenment that publicly aired and defined the issues and mobilized the pressure. But here I think Mendelssohn is a very complex figure, Because although in most respects, and in his conception of a Jewish Enlightenment or Haskalah, he should certainly be counted with the moderate Enlightenment, and was accused by Leo Strauss in his various writings, starting with Strauss's Spinoza's Critique of Religion in 1930, Mendelssohn was accused of a certain vacillation and hesitation between fundamental tendencies. When it comes to the issue of rights, universal and equal rights, he actually adopted a notably radical universalist and Spinozist line. You see this in Mendelssohn's preface to the German version, which was published at Mendelssohn's prompting, and with a very powerful preface written by Mendelssohn to Manasseh ben Israel's tract Vindiciae Judaeorum. And this is not just important in relation to Mendelssohn and to Manasseh ben Israel, but actually this is the first German text wholeheartedly to proclaim the principle of universal and equal rights of mankind in place of John Locke's much more conventional stratified rights, which is, of course, nothing to do with universal and equal rights and democratic modernity. So it's a text which significantly widened the gap between moderate and radical Enlightenment in a certain sector, while at the same time rendering Mendelssohn's own posture distinctly ambivalent. As Leo Strauss was later to emphasize, the whole drift of Mendelssohn's social and political thought in this text and in his major work Jerusalem of 1783 actually shadows Spinoza's TTP, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, in viewing individual happiness and the good of society as man's supreme goals. It was a stance that led Mendelssohn to insist on the need for Jewish political and jurisdictional integration into general society and participation in the common good. Mendelssohn's political thought was nothing less than subversive with respect to Jewish community organization and government, however conciliatory he is on the question of religious authority in strictly speaking, and too much so for his friend Dohm, Christian Wilhelm Dohm, who's, as everybody knows, whose crucial book, this is the second part, 1783, but the first part came out in 1781, launched the whole question of Jewish emancipation as a public issue in Germany, and not only in Germany, but had a very wide currency also beyond Germany, and in its French translation and Dutch translation and other translations in the 1780s. Dohm thought that actually Mendelssohn went too far in dismantling Jewish community jurisdiction and rabbinic jurisdiction. So, well received by some, Mendelssohn's trenchant preface was to the Manasseh ben Israel text was publicly condemned by some Protestant clergymen and generally condemned by Jewish community elders and rabbis due to its rigorous curtailing of religious authority. The 1780s, the decade immediately preceding the French Revolution, as you see from the handout, was the handout handed out? Yes, was the decisive decade in which radical Enlightenment ideas relating to Jewish emancipation first came to be widely diffused in French, German, Dutch, Italian, and even Polish. And one of the notable events that contributed to this growing diffusion was the Metz Academy Prize competition of 1787 on the question, are there means to render the Jews more useful to and happier in France? All three of the three declared prize winners strongly supported proposals for Jewish emancipation using radical Enlightenment arguments. But I shall concentrate on, I should have shown this slide just now. This is one of the works that did most to Europeanize and to circulate much more widely beyond Germany the implications of Mendelssohn's project and the way it relates to Dohm's project on emancipation of the Jews. So Mirabeau lent very powerful support to a project which by this time, by 1787, had become a really major issue in European debate and discussion, and in many European countries. One of the prize winners was, in response to the Metz Academy's prize competition, was a Catholic priest, but a very famous one, Henri Grégoire. So this is a very well-known text, but he was only one of the 3 prize winners, and I shall concentrate on a figure who's not as well known as he should be, a fascinating figure, and the only among the contestants responding to the Metz prize competition was the only Jewish competitor. And I think this sole Jewish competitor, Zalkind Horowitz, has a special relevance to the themes of my lecture. A Polish Jew who had wandered across Europe, learnt French, and obtained a job as keeper of the Hebrew manuscripts at the Bibliothèque du Roi in Paris in 1789. This text was published, and it became quite well known in France in the early stages of the French Revolution. In his ideas, Horowitz followed the logic of Daum, Dietz, Mirabeau, Brissot, and other non-Jewish radical enlighteners arguing for full Jewish emancipation. But he's an original and important figure, nonetheless, emerging as one of the first examples of a consciously anti-religious and anti-rabbinic Jewish revolutionary who also cared deeply about the fate of the Jewish people and brought a distinctive Jewish style, most obviously in his universal moralizing, but also in his cutting, sarcastic humor to the Radical Enlightenment arguments. The Metz Academy Prize competition of 1787, are there means to render the Jews more useful to and happier in France, seemed a deeply serious question to most enlighteners, recounts Horowitz. But initially, he could hardly believe his eyes. Could so crass and impertinent way of expressing the issue be taken seriously? What would the French say, he asked, were the Stockholm Royal Academy to pose the question whether there were ways to make Catholics more useful and happier in Sweden? When he first heard the question, he wrote, it reminded him of the Emperor Charles V, hypocritically ordering public prayers for the safety and deliverance of the Pope when it was the Emperor's own troops who were busily besieging and sacking the papal capital, Rome. How to render the Jews happy and useful? Nothing could be simpler. Cease rendering them wretched, oppressed, cramped, and useless by granting them, or rather returning to them, the rights of the citizen of which you deprive them contrary to all divine and human laws, while claiming to be Christians, and doing so contrary to society's own interests. Horowitz came originally from a Polish Jewish rabbinic family. He knew his Hebrew and Talmud, and his own personal identity as a Jew was never in question. But his unique role and personality poses in an important way the question, could an irreligious revolutionary Jew in the 1780s simultaneously care deeply about universal and equal rights and universal emancipation, and care deeply about the fate of the Jewish people, not just as a collection of individuals, but also in seeing some way for a distinctively secular Jewish identity to survive into the future and contribute to the well-being of society more generally. So this point leads on to it's a question, of course, that's still with us, and was the question that very eloquently posed by the great New York Jewish socialist and prophet of secular Yiddishkeit, Irving Howe, who died in 1993, who, at the close of his life, felt that Jewish secularism as a national political and moral tradition had a great point at one stage, but alas, is now finished. Well, was he right? The question of whether there is or isn't an enduring modern Jewish secularism that can simultaneously function as a modern Jewish national tradition and as a universal moral code seems to me a question of crucial relevance both to Israel and the Jewish diaspora outside today. It's a question bound up inextricably with Spinoza, the great Jewish philosopher who stood on the threshold of the Radical Enlightenment, and this in turn raises the question of Spinoza's role as there's Hartog to Hartog Limon. Spinoza's role as a disputed modern Jewish icon. There's no doubt that eventually Spinoza came to be adopted as a profound and universal religious inspiration, in particular by Mendelssohn, Heinrich Heine, and Moses Hess, but also by several other leading Central European opponents of the existing order. And there are quite a lot of interesting examples for the early 19th century that can be mentioned. The projected future democratic republic Spinoza envisages has certainly a negative coercive aspect, since it had to, as he saw it, confront the ignorant and prejudiced majority, which is the great barrier to making the world a better place and to improving the level of society in Spinoza and in this radical Enlightenment tradition more generally. So the Tractatus, but the Tractatus Theologico Politicus argues that the aim of society and every state is not just to enable men to live securely, safely, as in Hobbes, but also freely and satisfyingly, avoiding strife and providing scope for every individual to develop his or her potential to the utmost. The stated foundation and purpose of Spinoza's democratic republic is to avoid the follies of appetite as much as possible, constrain men within the limits of reason. That's where the coercive aspect is inevitable. There can't be any true freedom without this strong coercive aspect, because you've got to restrain the credulous vulgar. If you don't restrain the credulous vulgar, there can't be any true freedom. That's the paradox of Spinoza's political thought. And so constraining men within the limits of reason is the only way that they can be made or helped to dwell in peace and harmony. Spinoza's democratic republic therefore has a double role, constraining and encouraging, and the moral order that underpins its institutions needs to project both the rules governing coercion of the ignorant, who must, and people always think this phrase, forced to be free, is often associated by historians and by philosophers with Rousseau. And of course, Rousseau repeats this. But it's usually missed. Most historians miss the fact that Rousseau is taking this from Spinoza. The wording and the phrase, forced to be free, we find first in Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus. So Spinoza's common good is an institutional political concept which is the product of coercion and freedom standing in a complex relation to each other. It was the general interest understood as what best supports individual pursuit of worldly happiness, with theology and revelation stripped away, the collective power of all citizens within a society, popular sovereignty as it operates where all individual interests are treated as equal, which is the basis of this democratic republic. Hence, when Spinoza explains the difference between slavery and political liberty in chapter 16 of the TTP, he says that only in a state and government where the salus, the well-being of the whole people, and not that of the supreme ruler, is the supreme law, only when you live in a society like that is one living in freedom. When Spinoza discusses the need to subordinate religious worship and pious conduct to the peace and interests of the state at the start of chapter 19 of the TTP, he expresses this as accommodating religion to the peace and utility of the republic. Well, it's time for me to draw these threads to a conclusion. And in the full version of the lecture, there's a little bit more detail about some of the issues than I've had time to actually include in the delivered form of the lecture now. But let me just conclude by saying that what was envisaged by Spinoza, and which I think is a continuing tradition through this radical Enlightenment tendency, which seemed to be winning the battle against its opponents in the early stages of the French Revolution, but which was then thwarted and, after a fierce and bitter conflict, of course, overwhelmed by the Montagne, by a new populist authoritarianism of Robespierre and the terror from who captured control of the revolution by a coup d'etat in June 1793. So what happened was that between 1789 and 1793, for example, you have complete freedom of the press, as well as full individual freedom and the whole principle of universal and equal rights. So not only is universal and equal rights completely overthrown in June 1793, historians often, I think, almost reprehensibly understate this. But of course, freedom of the press, every form of freedom is completely, it's not just that a lot of people's heads were cut off with guillotines. That's a relatively superficial feature. The real thing is there is no such thing as free expression of opinion. That's not allowed anymore once the people take control, according to the Montagne. So this is a completely different conception of the revolution that captured control in June 1793, and a complete rejection. Everyone, even Zalkin Horvitz, although he was amazingly brave and did publish one or two protests in the newspapers, was forced to shut up. And there's no freedom of expression in the Robespierre period, and of course there's a lot of to and froing, and the revolutionary impulse recovers after 1815, but then is defeated again in 1830 and again in 1848. But through all of this, the ground plan for a world based on justice and charity, and accompanying it, this Jewish secularism that I've tried to describe in this lecture, I think must at the same time be viewed as closely tied to the deepest, most lasting values of Spinoza's and the Radical Enlightenment's notion of authentic or a true religion, or as he also puts it, which is meant to embrace religion in its various formats, including what, because they distinguish between true Christianity and the Christianity taught by the churches, which is a hopeless perversion, according to them. So true Christianity is part of this genuine religion. It's an ultra-Socinian and Unitarian doctrine in some of its manifestations in the Radical Enlightenment, but in Spinoza, it's a very important element, the way he portrays Jesus and true Christianity as distinct from the Christianity of the churches, which is a terribly oppressive thing. And I think that this whole complex of ideas together have to be seen as something that formed a basis which did become submerged after 1848 by or displaced by the rise of socialism and Marxism, that's for sure. But again, in the 20th century, with a renewed emphasis on basic human rights, on universal and equal rights after 1948, has become a major feature of the world that we live in today. So we must ask whether the way that Spinoza and the Radical Enlightenment viewed true religion, including what they call true Christianity. And remember, for Martin Buber, not only was there the question, is there a Jewish cultural legacy, which is in some sense separate from religious tradition, but also, is it possible perhaps to see the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in a very different way from how it traditionally has been seen? I think this links up, this is my last sentence now, I hope there will be time for 2 or 3 questions. This does link up, or was linked up by Martin Buber with his doctrine that Jesus was a Jew to the core, in whom the Jewish desire for realization was concentrated, and in whom it came to a breakthrough. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. We're not surprised after hearing the fantastic introduction by Yosef It was really a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much. And now, time for some questions. Yes, please.
Is there a way to...
Please, one moment, please.
Is there a way to read your... to have a written... through the internet, or a written form of your
lecture? Well, I'm hoping that the Academy will be kind enough to publish it eventually, and including a few of the details that I had to omit for reasons of time. So in its full format, I hope that will happen. Yes.
And another thing, can we expect a translation into Hebrew to one or more of your books?
There is actually a pamphlet being prepared in Hebrew of my account of the French Revolution, which has caused a lot of, Professor Kaplan referred to this, there's been quite a lot of debate and also some quite bad-tempered discussion about this, because it rather goes against the most prevailing views of the French Revolution. So there is a pamphlet coming out in Hebrew which will present this analysis, this way of looking at the French Revolution.
Yes, please. Okay.
Thank you. In the paper that you gave us, there is a quite interesting point about emancipation in France. There is a 1.5 year difference between the equal right for Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews. Yes. Can you elaborate on this? What institute made the difference?
Well, since the medieval expulsions of the Jews from the Kingdom of France, of course, France had grown larger, and Alsace-Lorraine was not part of medieval France, but became part of France in Louis XIV's time. And the largest Jewish population, the Ashkenazic Jews in France, were living mostly in, Metz was a garrison town, but often in small places in Alsace. This is where you found most of the Ashkenazic Jews in France and around Nancy. But the Sephardic community, of course, had grown up around the Portuguese New Christian immigrants who had settled mainly in Bordeaux and Bayonne in the southwest of France. There was also the ancient community in Avignon under papal jurisdiction, because Avignon was not part of France until 1789, when the revolution incorporated it into France. So there were three elements in French Jewry. And it was felt, well, the Portuguese, the Sephardic Jews in Bordeaux and Bayonne had were much more prosperous, but also in their lifestyle were more integrated in society. So it was somehow, and they were a smaller group. So it caused less. The proposal in 1789 was to emancipate all the Jews, but the resistance was tremendous from the public. It was, but also in the national legislature. You mustn't think just because this is the French Revolution and they will say we're going to change everything and we want universal and equal rights. This means they were all in favor of Jewish emancipation. Not at all. Most of them weren't, and it was extremely difficult to push it through. Very difficult. And in the end, they had to settle just for the Sephardic Jews, and the Ashkenazim were left out to 2 years later. But even then, there was a lot of anti-Semitic incidents, especially in Strasbourg and Nancy and in Alsace-Lorraine generally, and in 1789, 1790, 1791, and continuing through the revolution, there was always a great deal of resistance to the concept. We are a Christian land. We are not going to give rights to the Jews. This is a very, very powerful sentiment in France. So even in the very midst of the French Revolution, it was extremely embattled and very difficult to push through Jewish emancipation.
Documented?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
We have another question here.
I'd like to ask you about Tollens Nazarenus, which seems to imply...
One moment, please. I want you to be heard.
Tollens Nazarenus, which was written a few years after the naturalization pamphlet, refers to the Jews as a religion and as a nation.
Yeah.
And it seems to imply that restoration of the Jews is a quite possibility, but I'd like to ask you to address the question of how the Radical Enlightenment viewed the Jews specifically, especially the way you want to present a sort of a secular Judaism, specifically as a nation.
Yeah.
That is, how does that figure into some sort of a secular sort of...
Well, again, Salkin Hurwitz is probably a very good illustration here, because he has a great deal of social sympathy for the Jewish cause. He's very anti-rabbinic and very much out of sympathy with Jewish observance. But you see, I think Jewish life was so separate from the other elements of society at the end of the 18th century that it was very difficult to imagine anything like a sort of assimilation that you saw in Germany by the beginning of the 20th century, where the Jews become almost invisible, at least at first sight. People couldn't imagine a situation like that because there was nothing approaching that in the 18th century. So I think it was much more obvious than it might seem to us that you could simultaneously say, I want universal and equal rights, and that there is no real problem of Jewish distinctiveness continuing as part of that. Whereas to us, that would seem much more problematic.
Wasn't Clermont Tonnerre saying exactly that? Wasn't he saying that Jews must cease as a nation?
Who?
Clermont Tonnerre.
Oh no, lots of those that were in favor of emancipation, and especially Henri Grégoire, who I talked about, had the idea we want the Jews to disappear. In fact, we want to convert them to Christianity. That was often a motive, but that certainly was not what these Jewish revolutionaries were thinking about, or. See, I wouldn't... Well, Grégoire is a complicated case, which I don't want to go into too much detail about. There were very few senior Catholic ecclesiastics that tried to combine Catholicism with the Democratic Republic and universal and equal rights. But there were a few, like Claude Fauchet and so on. But because they found that they were defying the bishops and the Pope, because the Pope condemned universal and equal rights. There's no such thing as universal and equal rights for mankind. These are those very, very few, because it's just a tiny handful, who are trying to combine Catholicism with Radical Enlightenment, got themselves into a lot of theological, quite a theological twist. So, but that's I think that's a subsidiary strand, let's say, and a complicated story in itself. And but I don't think that's not part of what I would define as the Radical Enlightenment, which by definition is not interested in deferring to ecclesiastical authority in the way that Grégoire was trying to do.
So the last question, please.
Could you say something about the position of the Enlightenment, whether moderate or radical, not about Jews in the abstract, but about Jews who did not accept the principles of the Enlightenment, who didn't accept those principles? In other words, a strand of intolerance within the Enlightenment that was validated by Enlightenment principles toward people who didn't accept Enlightenment principles.
Yeah. Well, certain Enlighteners, and above all Voltaire, who comes into a lot of flack. Two of the Jewish revolutionaries I mentioned in the late 18th century, David Nassi and Salkin Hurwitz in particular, who has very interesting passages on Voltaire, really launch into him on this, because they show how his idea that that the intolerance and bigotry, which add so much to the oppression and disfigurement of 18th century society, essentially the work of the Christian churches. Voltaire was happy to stress that. But that the Christian churches derive this from Jewish superstition and Jewish superstition and Jewish ignorance and so on. They would use a whole list of terms to describe. So he develops this, Voltaire especially develops this, but a lot of others do as well, into a new form of Enlightenment anti-Semitism. And I think that part of I mentioned Arthur Herzberg's analysis, that part of it seems to me absolutely correct. And that was perhaps a more prominent aspect of the Enlightenment, certainly you might think so in the middle of the 18th century, than this radical Enlightenment tendency, which was still to some extent underground and veiled from most people's eyes, that I've been describing. So the Enlightenment, not only is moderate Enlightenment something very different from radical Enlightenment, but when it comes to the validity, the status of Jews and Judaism in a wider cultural and social sense, I think moderate and radical Enlightenment have, as I try to describe in the lecture, completely different visions, because for most moderate Enlighteners, Jews and Judaism is something extremely negative, and that would be true of Hume and true of or in the case of Locke, it's something that you have to overcome and conquer, and eventually the Jews will have to be Christianized. But all of that is completely irrelevant for the radical Enlightenment.
Well, so thank you very much again. The evening is not over yet. Professor Jonathan Israel, you earned the Buber Medal, and it is with gratitude and appreciation we confer it upon you. Now you have to open it and show it to the photographer.
Something unexpected and absolutely amazing for me and marvelous. Oh, what a beautiful medal!
Yes,
hold it up. I don't know whether. So it's really quite a handsome looking medal. I've never seen it before.
So thank you very much.
Very many thanks.
And thank you, our guests, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you. Good evening.